Estamos grabando. Estamos grabando la clase del grupo. ¿Qué grupo es este? ¿Este es el grupo 2 o no? Solo para revisar, denme un segundo. Sí, grupo 2. Le puse grupo 2 porque son los segundos que salen en mi lista, pero para que se acuerden ustedes también. Esta es la clase del grupo 2 del 27 del 8 del 2021. Y hoy día tenemos que comenzar con sentences, pero antes de eso vamos a dar una vuelta hacia clauses, así para poder tener la cosa como más del principio. ¿Ok? Let's do it. Una 20. ¿Se ve bien o no? ¿Sí? Sí.
Sí, profe.
Ya, todo esto lo vuelvo a decir, el profe es un flight y lo copió y lo pegó desde Cambridge Online Dictionary, así que usted lo puede buscar, ahí está el tema, lo vamos a ir explicando a poco. Clauses, introduction. A clause is the basic unit of grammar. I won't say that. It is not the basic unit of grammar. I would say that the morpheme is the basic unit of grammar. Typically, a main clause is made up of a subject, that is to say, a noun phrase and a verb phrase. Sometimes the verb phrase is followed by other elements, for example, objects, complements, adjuncts. These other elements are sometimes essential to complete the meaning of the clause. Okay, we're going to start with our discussion by using this. And the very first stuff we're going to say is about the idea of the grammatical hierarchy. The grammatical hierarchy. The grammatical hierarchy is a division of language. It was made during the 20th century, or perhaps even before that. Most certainly, it was made before that. Well, the grammatical hierarchy then is a division of language into units. That is to say, some people were trying to analyze language and they figured it out that you can actually divide the language into smaller units so you can analyze them in a better shape. The idea of the grammatical hierarchy then is presenting the students or the community with comprehensive, I would say, with a comprehensive form in which we can actually provide linguistic analysis or language analysis. The grammatical hierarchy then is divided into elements, right? And the smallest one is the idea of morpheme, right? Which is the smallest element with meaning and form. Then one or more morphemes will create lexeme, a lexeme, which is some people call these things words, right? What common people call word. Uh, one or more lexemes will create phrases, and this was the very end of our first course. Phrases, they will get their names out of lexemes, right? So you will have nouns and then noun phrases, verbs and then verb phrase, and so on and so forth, right? One or more phrases will create clauses. And one or more clauses will create sentences. That is to say, this is the grammatical hierarchy. The grammatical hierarchy as a hierarchy then is divided into, I would say, levels, stages. And these levels and stages are made, or they are organized as a pyramid, right? But as an upside down pyramid is the other way around, with the smallest element at the very bottom of it and the biggest element on top. That is to say that the biggest element contains all the rest of them. And then the same idea goes once you start going down in the pyramid. We're going to devote time to the idea of clause, okay? So this is what we're going to talk. A clause then is one or more phrases but one of these phrases must be a verb phrase. That's the rule. So a clause is a group of phrases, but one of those phrases must be a verb phrase. In that respect, A clause is the basic unit of grammar. We don't agree with that. We believe the basic unit of grammar is the morpheme, I would say. Yeah, you can argue against that, but we're not going to do it here. Typically, a main clause is made up of a subject and a verb phrase. Okay, here we have some other stuff. Clauses are organized with following the idea of something called valency pattern. This is how we organize clauses. That is to say, clauses aren't created at random. That people don't speak just because, right? They follow rules, even though they don't know them, right? These rules or the way in which a clause is being organized is called valency pattern in certain grammars. In some other grammars, they call it verb subcategorization or even verb complementation. Okay, but we're going to call it valency pattern. Um, Here comes the idea of certain units, more units. The idea of subject, the idea of verb, the idea of object, the idea of complement, and the idea of adverbial. Right? That is to say, the subject is the doer of the action. Right? The entity which is performing the action entailed by the verb phrase. The verb, verbal in other grammars, they are called, or it is there because it entails the idea of action, right? The object is the receiver of the action. The complement is extra information, or I would say a characteristic, characterizes. The subject or the object. Meanwhile, adverbial means circumstantial information. As the subject is the doer of the action, it is usually, not always, but usually, created by a noun phrase. The verb phrase as an action is represented by a verb phrase. The object, as it is the receiver of the action, therefore another entity, is another noun phrase, not always, but in most cases. Complement is usually, as it is a characteristic, is an adjective phrase. And adverbials are usually, not always, but usually prepositional phrases, adverb phrases, and sometimes noun phrases. Okay, all over again. Clauses then are being organized following a valency pattern. These patterns can't be changed. There aren't so many. We're going to review them all. And inside of the valency pattern, we have more units. These units are subjects, verb, object, complement, and adverbial, right? The way in which we're going to arrange these different units is going to be called a valency pattern. Therefore, and as you can see, each one of these units is being performed or is being created by a phrase, right? So, my first question. Todo el mundo revisó frases el semestre pasado, ¿cierto? Los que estuvieron conmigo sí lo hicieron. Las personas que no estuvieron conmigo revisaron frases, las vieron todas. Antes de avanzar.
Sí, profe.
Ya, bacán. Entonces, si digo noun phrase, verb phrase, adjective phrase, adverb phrase, todo el mundo sabe de lo que estamos hablando. Ya, maravilloso. Avanzamos.
Sí, eso sí.
Bacancito. I'm going to read it again. Clauses. A clause is the basic unit of grammar. Typically, a main clause is made up. Oh, main clause. Main clause. Main clause. Clauses can be subdivided into at least two different things. One called independent clause also called main in some grammars, or even matrix. Meanwhile, the other is called dependent. And in some other places, they call it subordinate, right? Which means that there are certain clauses which can stand on their own and having full meaning, right? There are certain clauses which can stand on their own having full meaning. Those are independent clauses. Meanwhile, there are other clauses which can't stand on their own because they don't have enough meaning. Those are called dependent clauses, right? Typically, a main clause, that is to say, an independent clause, is made up of a subject plus a verb phrase, a subject and a verb. That is to say, a noun phrase subject and a verb phrase verb. Sometimes the verb phrase is followed by other elements, objects, complements, adjuncts, slash adverbials. We call them adverbials. These other elements are sometimes essential to complete the meaning of the clause. For example, Sarah smiled. Sarah smiled is a clause. How do I know that? Okay, first example, Sarah smiled. Crap. Okay, Sarah smiled is a clause. How do I know that? Because it is composed, it is built out of phrases. Which are those phrases? Well, the very first stuff I'm going to do whenever I try to analyze a clause is separating or identify. I need to identify the verb phrase. I'm going to look for a verb. Therefore, Sarah smiled. The only verb is smile. Therefore, I'm going to separate it using round brackets. On top of that, I'm going to state the form. Which is the form of smile? Smile is a verb phrase. And the function is verb, right? So the symbol for verb is V. Smile, then, as it is only one verb, this is the verb head. V, form, function, head. Then I'm going to try to look for the subject of this clause. So I'm going to use the verb and I'm going to ask something. I'm going to ask who, right? So who smiled? Sarah. Sarah then is another unit inside of the clause. Sarah apparently is a noun, so I'm going to try to prove it. So I'm going to replace it by a pronoun because pronouns replace entire noun phrases. So I'm going to say she smiled. It works, therefore is a noun phrase. Form, and the function is subject. Therefore, the symbol for subject is S. As Sarah is the only element, it's the head. ¿Alguna pregunta de lo que hice?
No, profe.
Vale.
No, profe.
Avanzamos. Joe doesn't feel well. Joe doesn't feel well. Okay, I'm going to repeat the entire process. Okay, Joe doesn't feel well apparently is a clause, so I'm going to look for the verbs. I can see that Joe doesn't feel well has two verbs, doesn't feel, therefore I have one verb phrase, right? This is a verb phrase form, and the function is verb. Instead of that, I have two different verbs. Feel is the main verb, therefore the verb head, and doesn't is an auxiliary verb, performing the role of pre-modifier. Then I'm going to look for the subject. Who doesn't feel well? Joe. So Joe is the subject, right? Apparently Joe is a noun phrase, so I'm going to try to prove it by replacing it by a pronoun, with a pronoun, sorry. So I'm going to say he doesn't feel well. Yeah, it works. It's a noun phrase. form, and the function is the doer of the action, therefore subject, as Joe is a noun and the only element is the head. Then I'm going to ask, how does Joe feel? He doesn't feel well. Well, right? So well is another element, right? Well is an adjective, right? As it is the only element is the head. As the head is an adjective, this is an adjective phrase. And well is providing information about Joe, therefore is complementing the subject. Therefore, the valency pattern for this clause is subject, verb, complement. And for the previous one is subject, verb. The complement, its symbol is a capital letter C. Another stuff, I asked who in order to find, okay, I need to find the verb and then I'm going to ask who with the verb, right? So as to find the subject. And then for the complement, I'm going to ask how, right? Any question?
No, profe.
Good. Let's move on.
Can you
Dígame.
repeat? Under the doesn't, what does it say?
I wrote down this. Auxiliary verb,
Ah,
esa es la forma y la función es pre-modifier because
thank,
modifies the head and it's before that.
okay, thank you.
Okay. They haven't posted all invitations. They haven't posted all invitations. Okay. They haven't. They haven't posted all invitations. Okay. I'm going to say it once more out loud. This is a clause, therefore there's a verb. I'm going to look for the verb. I'm going to read it. They haven't posted all invitations. Verbs haven't and posted. So therefore, that's my verb phrase, right? The form is a verb phrase. The role, the function is a verb. Posted is the verb head. How do I know that? Because the last verb is always the main verb. Pre-modifier. Who posted? They, right? No problem. I can see a pronoun. That's a subject. That's a pronoun acting as a head. What have they posted? What have they posted? What have they posted? All invitations, right? This is invitations is the noun head, and all is a determiner, pre-modifier. This stuff is a noun form, and the function is object. Why? Because it's the receiver of the action. How do I know that? Because it answers the question. Well, the symbol is O, and the question is what? Let's do one more. I'll call you later. Okay, the verb phrase is this one, right? Verb phrase, verb, call, verb, head. This is will, therefore an auxiliary verb. Pre-modifier, I is a pronoun, head of a noun phrase, subject. Who will I call? You, the receiver of the action, another pronoun. And this is a noun phrase, object. When, later, right? Later is an adverb, head, creating an adverb phrase, which is acting as an adverbial. Therefore, Adverbial symbol is a, and you can find them by asking when, where, why, and some others. With this, I I've explained I've explained the way in which clauses work, how they are created, how they're being analyzed, and how they're divided. ¿Alguna pregunta de lo que hice o de lo que he dicho hasta ahora?
No, profe.
No, estamos bien.
Profe, a
Dígame.
mí me queda una duda. En el tema, en la adverbial circunstancial, como que no supe identificarlo en el later.
Tienes que pensar que an adverbial is extra information and they give you information about a place, right? An adverbial of place of or time, for example, the last one on the one hand. That's the very first stuff. The second stuff is that adverbials are optional. You can erase them or even you can move them without changing the clause meaning, right? So for example, in I'll call you later, perhaps I can move that adverbial. I later will call you, or later I will call you. You see, and you don't change much. And I mean, yeah, you change the meaning anyway, but it is not a big change, right? You're not meaning something different. No sé si le queda claro.
Sí, pero por ejemplo, no siempre, o sea, siempre que sea un adverbial, o sea, adverb phrase va a ser adverbial.
Debería tender a ser un adverbial. Los adverb phrases, they tend to be adverbials, but this is language. I can't tell you like 100%. I don't have that
Ok,
info.
ya, muchas gracias.
Okay. Any other question? Guys, girls, people.
No, profe.
Ya, avanzamos. Clauses. Introduction. Valency pattern. The pattern of a clause, the pattern of clause elements that can occur with a verb, for example, intransitive, monotransitive, and stuff. Okay. This definition comes from Biber, and in that definition, you can see that the patterns will occur because of the verb. Which verb? The main verb. And because of the pattern, that is to say, the presence of objects or not, we are going to provide names for the verb, like a classification, a further classification. So in this respect, we have intransitive, if you don't have objects, monotransitive, but we don't care much about that, right? The important thing here is valency pattern are the ways in which we organize clauses. Second definition. Valency pattern, a term with the same general meaning as verb subcategorization, verb pattern, or verb complementation. I already told you that. Why is this important? Because perhaps in some other grammars, or if you try to study on your own, you will find these and other names, right? These other names. So it's good for you to know that. Subject. A subject is one of the 5 major elements of clause structure. We know that. The other 4 are verb, object, complement, and adjunct. We call them adverbials. Subjects are essentially declarative, negative, and interrogative clauses. Yeah, because subjects are the entity, right? The subject acts as the doer or agent of an action. Subjects are typically noun phrases or a noun or a pronoun and any dependent words before or after it. So you have to be sort of careful with subjects because they tend to be noun phrases, but there are places or there are other forms in which you can also create noun subjects without using noun phrases. Here you have examples of that. The teacher told the class to sit down. Who told the class? The teacher. That's the subject. Doesn't he eat meat? Who doesn't? He. That's the subject. And with the rest is the same idea. I won't say much. Subject. In statements, the subject comes before the verb. That's another interesting stuff. Once you have the verb, the subject is the unit which is in front of it. So for example, they love eating out, right? Which is the subject, the very first unit. Why? Because it's in front of the verb phrase. So I'm looking for the verb phrase, love, and then the one which is in front of that, they, that's a subject. In questions, the subject comes after the auxiliary or modal verb and before the main verb. In questions is different because you move the auxiliary verb, therefore it is not in the very first place. In the example, do you want a cup of tea? Then the subject is you, that's the doer. Who wants a cup of tea? You, right? And that's the subject. I won't say much about that. Objects. An object is one of the five major elements of clause structure. The other four are subjects, verbs, adverbials, and complements. Objects are typically noun phrases, nouns or pronouns. Objects normally follow the verb phrase in a clause. So, for example, everyone likes her. The object is her. Why? Because it's the receiver of the action, right? Everyone likes her. Who everyone like? Her, right? Therefore, that's the object. First hint. Second hint, it is after the verb phrase. Second hint. Third hint is a noun phrase. The following. She knows everyone. Okay, she knows everyone. Who does she know? Everyone. That's the receiver of the action. First hint. It is after the verb phrase. Second hint is a pronoun, therefore a verb phrase, a noun phrase. Third hint. It is important for you to realize that here is a pronoun, but do you know the exact name for that pronoun? How do we call that pronoun? ¿Lo saben?
¿Nombre propio?
No, esos son los sujetos. Se llaman los personal pronouns, son los sujetos. Y los que
It's
son,
not like indefinite.
no, that's called object pronoun. Object
Profe,
pronoun.
¿cuál era la pregunta?
Si sabíamos cuál era el nombre, la clasificación exacta de here. Es un pronombre, sí, pero hay muchos pronombres. Pero, ¿qué pronombre es entonces? Es un object pronoun. ¿Por qué object pronoun? Porque se ocupa en lugar de objeto. Everyone también es un pronoun. ¿Saben el nombre de ese pronoun? Ese es más difícil. Everyone también es un pronoun y se llama compound indefinite pronoun. Y son especiales porque les puedo colocar un adverbio después. Puedo decir everyone, no, un adjetivo. Everyone brave. Por eso son especiales y por eso me acuerdo. ¿Dudas? ¿Avanzo? Avanzo. Okay. Los objects, they can be subdivided into two. Valency pattern objects. There are direct objects and indirect objects. A direct object is the thing or person that is affected by the action of the verb. An indirect object is usually a person who receives a direct object. Example, they gave her a present when she left. Okay, I'm gonna try to do it over here. They gave her a present. They gave her a present. Escríbala en su cuaderno, intente hacerla y la revisamos. 3 minutos, cortito. 2 minutos y revisamos. ¿Estamos listos, no? Ya, revisemos. They gave here a present. The very first stuff we're going to do to begin our analysis is looking for the verb phrase, this one. Then I'm going to ask who gave, they, and then be very careful with this. I'm going to ask what did they give a present, right? What did they give a present? Do you realize that I used the previous 2 units so as to find the third? What did they give a present? Now take a look at this. To whom did they give a present? To her. With that idea in mind, you can see how the action goes straight to a present and indirectly to her. Therefore, here, even though it's a noun phrase, is an object, but not any object, is an indirect object. And a present, even though it's a noun phrase, is an object, but not any object, a direct object. So we have new stuff here. Indirect object. You ask to whom, right? And the symbol is a big O and a small I. Direct object. You ask what, and the symbol is a capital O and a small d. Then you can provide the rest of the analysis, but it's not relevant for our stuff. ¿Entendieron cómo identificar un indirect object y un direct object?
Profe, ¿lo podía repetir un poco de nuevo, por favor?
Ningún problema. They gave her a present, ¿cierto? Primero busco el verbo, gave. Con el verbo encuentro el resto. Gave then is the action. Therefore, I'm going to ask who. Who gave her a present? They, right? So that's the subject, the doer of the action. With both of them, I'm going to try to look for a direct object. So I'm going to ask what. What did they give a present? Do you realize that I use the 2 previous forms? I mean, the 2 previous units, the subject and the verb, so as to find the object, right? What did they give? What did they give a present? And now I'm going to use the three previous ones so as to find the one that I'm missing. So I'm going to say, to whom did they give a present? To her. Therefore, that's my proof that the action goes straight to a present, therefore direct object, and indirectly to her, therefore indirect object. No sé si queda claro.
Sí, profe, ahora quedó más claro.
Ya, maravilloso. ¿Alguien más? ¿Alguna duda? No? Okay. Direct objects, I won't say much. Indirect objects, indirect objects, I won't say much. You can read them later on. Verbs and object, complements. Okay. Complements are difficult because they provide a characteristic for the subject or an object. So complements are one of the 5 major elements of the clause structure. The other 4 are whatever. Complements are in bold. Both the brothers become doctors. Playing the guitar has always makes me happy. Right? Okay. The problem with complements, I think I'm going to try to explain it with this form. I'm going to use this. Complements, they can't go with any verb. They need some specific verbs. Okay, that's the very first stuff. I am tall. Okay, so this is the verb. This is the verb. This is the subject, and this is something else, right? So the action, who is tall? I, right? And then how am I? Tall, right? Tall is an adjective phrase performing the role of subject. And as you can see, is providing information about the subject, right? Because you can ask who is tall, right? And how is that person? The complement then is called subject complement because it goes to the subject. But we have another one called, oh, come on, you can do it. We have another one. We have this another one. In this place, the verb is this one. Consider, I is the subject. I'm going to write it down immediately. Now, I considered who? I considered you. How? Guilty. You is a noun phrase, and as the receiver of the action is an object. And guilty is an adjective phrase and is providing information about something, but about what? About you. It's providing information about that. Who is guilty? You. How I consider you? Guilty, right? So there's a connection between guilty and you. Therefore, this is not a subject complement, but an object complement. Therefore, there are 2 types of complements. Subject complement it answers the question how. The symbol is capital C, small s, and then crap. It's not like that. Object complement. It also answers the question how, but it goes to the object. Okay. Any question?
Sí, profe, podría repetir eso de los complementos de nuevo.
Es simple, son adjective phrases que están después del verbo, ¿cierto? Profe, ¿puedo tener un complement adelante del verbo? No, no podéis tener eso, siempre van después. Son adjective phrases que entregan información de o el sujeto o el objeto. ¿Sí? son complicados porque hay que revisar bien qué información entregan. Usualmente son adjective phrases, pero si tú lo ves en el ejemplo, doctors es un noun y también es un complemento. Both the brothers become doctors. Doctors sería el complemento de the brothers. Pero ¿por qué es un complemento y no un objeto? Depende mucho del verbo que tengan también. Como ayuda, les puedo decir que el verbo to be genera complementos, porque son adjetivos los que vienen después usualmente. Lo vamos a ver con calma en un momento después cuando comencemos a trabajar. Lo otro importante del mismo ejemplo, I consider you guilty. ¿Se dan cuenta de que you es un objeto, pero no puse si era indirecto o directo? No puse nada porque es el único objeto. La única vez en la que vamos a hacer la diferencia entre objeto directo o indirecto es si es que hay dos objetos. Si hay solo un objeto, siempre es directo, entonces no se le pone nada. ¿Queda claro? ¿Más dudas?
Queda claro, profe.
Perfecto.
Entendió.
Tranquilidad, si vamos, le vamos a dar. Chiquillos, vamos a parar 15 minutos, son las 14:04. Volvemos a las 14:20, ¿ya? Para tomar agüita, vaya a comer azúcar, hágase un café. Estamos jugando todavía, que no quiero ser mala onda, pero no ha pasado nada todavía. Volvemos con análisis, así que eso. Volvemos a las 14:15 minutos, 14:20. Ya, chiquillos, ¿alguna duda de lo que hemos visto hasta ahora? No, avanzamos. Yorka, ¿qué pasó? ¿Tiene alguna duda? Premodifier significa, Yorka, que es una palabra, un lexema, que está dentro de una frase y que entrega información sobre el head de esa frase. Ejemplo, beautiful house, la palabra más importante es house, y beautiful nos da una descripción de house. Entonces la modifica. Entonces modifier. Y como está adelante, antes, se llama premodifier. Puede pasar que también esté atrás, como por ejemplo everyone brave. La más importante es everyone y brave nos dice cómo es everyone. Entonces la modifica y como está después es post modifier. ¿Me queda claro? Ok. En la pantalla está el resumen de los valency patterns. Esos son todos los que existen. Mírelos. Cuidado, lo saqué del libro de Biber y él cambia algunos nombres. Se dan cuenta que dice subject predicative. Biber nombra a los complements como predicative. Entonces dice subject complement. Eso. Quiero que me digan si hay más dudas antes de avanzar o no.
Profe, entonces los predicativos serían los complements.
Exacto. Exacto. ¿No hay más dudas? No. Ya, entonces con esto queda cerrado el tema de Valency Patterns y cómo es una cláusula. ¿Ya? Así que avanzo al otro PPT. Este lo tiene en
Profe,
su correo. Dígame.
eso lo envió al correo, ¿cierto?
Está en su correo, sí.
Ya, gracias.
complex compound sentences and subordination. Complex sentences. A complex sentence is an independent clause joined by one or more dependent clauses. Okay, so with this, we have something new. We have the following idea. The idea is that clauses can be divided into independent clauses and dependent clauses. Right? Right. On the one hand. On the other hand, sentences are created by one or more clauses. Okay? So the idea is that you can have different type of sentences, different types of sentences. The simple sentence is created by one independent clause. Then you have the complex sentence. Which is created by one independent clause plus one or more dependent clauses. Okay? And then you have two more. The compound sentence is created by two or more independent clauses and finally the mixture, complex compound. Which is made out of a compound sentence and a complex sentence. That is to say, two or more complex independent clauses, two or more independent clauses más one or more dependent clauses. All over again, clauses can be divided into independent or dependent, and then sentences, as they are made out of clauses, can be subdivided into four, into simple sentences, one independent clause, complex sentence, one independent plus any number of dependent clauses, compound sentences, any number of two or more independent clauses, and then finally complex compound sentences, which is a compound, that is to say, two or more independent clauses plus complex, that is to say, one or more dependent clauses. Simple, complex, compound, complex, compound. Complex sentences, that is to say, one independent plus dependent, one independent plus dependent. A complex sentence is an independent clause joined by one or more dependent clauses. We know that. A subordinating conjunction begins the dependent clauses. Okay, what's a subordinating conjunction? Subordinating conjunctions are words which we're going to use to link, to connect things, like one word to another, or one phrase to another, or one clause to another, and even sentences, right? So a subordinating conjunction begins the dependent clause. A dependent clause that begins a sentence must be followed by comma, the orthographic sign, right? And a dependent clause has a subject and a verb as any other clause, but it doesn't make sense on its own because it lacks of meaning. I don't like that idea, but we're going to review them. Okay. On the screen, you can see different sentences, okay? So I'm going to take one of them, this one, and we're going to paste it on our okay, and I'm going to reduce the size of it, and that's it. Okay, so the very first stuff we're going to do is reading it, okay? Por ejemplo, antes, sí, Fabricio, muy bien. Eso es una coordinating conjunction. Después explicamos la diferencia entre coordinating y subordinating. Pero sí es una conjunction, une cosas. Okay, I'm going to read it. After he gave it some thought, the mouse decided to wait until later for his trek. After he gave it some thought, the mouse decided to wait until later for his trek. Once more. After he gave it some thought, the mouse decided to wait until later for his trek. And as you can see, this is a sentence. How do I know that? This is a sentence because it is created out of clauses. In this example, we have two different clauses. Can you see them? Can anybody tell me which are those clauses? Can anybody tell me which those clauses are? Those.
I can say it.
Perdón,
I can say it after he gave it some thought. Is dependent.
is the dependent one, right? Good, very good, very good. Fabrizio also, yeah, okay, you're correct as well. So after he gave it some thought, the mouse decided to wait until later for his trek is a sentence made out of two clauses. The first of them is after he gave it some thought, as your classmate was saying, and the other one is the mouse decided to wait until later for his trek. Now the question is, which one is independent and which one is dependent? And we have this hint.
Profe, una consulta, perdón por
Dígame.
interrumpirlo. ¿Podría de nuevo dar como la definición de independent, Que eso me costó.
Independent significa que es una cláusula que puede estar sola porque tiene el suficiente significado para eso. Esa es una forma. Y la dependent es una cláusula que no tiene todo el significado, por lo tanto necesita estar pegada a una independent. Por un lado. Después tenemos esta definición, que una dependent comienza con una subordinating conjunction, que una dependent, si está adelante, la separa de la independent por una coma, y eso. Ahora veo el ejemplo. After he gave it some thought, the mouse decided to wait until later for his trek. ¿Cuál será la independent y cuál será la dependent?
La primera es la dependent.
¿Cierto? Comienza con after. Busquemos after en el diccionario. After puede ser muchas cosas. Preposición, dice ahí. Adverbio, dice ahí. Conjunction, dice ahí. Puede ser cualquier cosa. La vamos a ver. After he gave it some thoughts. No puede ser preposición porque después de ella viene un pronombre. Las preposiciones no tienen pronombre después de ellas. Y adverb tendría que poder moverlo. O sea, podría decir, he gave it some thought. The mouse decided to wait until later for his trek after. No tiene ningún sentido. Ese after está pegado a he gave it some thought. Es una conjunction. On the other hand, or following the same idea, after he gave it some thought, he separated from the other clause by a comma, right? So yes, it's a dependent clause. Okay, so we're going to provide an analysis for this. The very first stuff we're going to do is this. As this is a clause, we are going to separate it from the rest of the sentence by using square brackets, not round brackets, but square brackets. Good. And now we know this is a dependent clause. That's the form, and the function is adverbial. I can tell you that because it means time, right? Is right after that action that this another action happens. Now I have to provide the phrases inside of this clause. What I'm going to do then is looking for the verb. The verb is gave. Who gave? He gave. What did he give? Some thoughts. To whom? To it. Right? After, as it is a subordinating conjunction, it's outside of the subject, and you have to write down its form, subordinating conjunction. And that's all, because that's the very same function. Then I have to say, what is this? This is a noun phrase performing the role of subject inside of the dependent clause. The subject is performed by a pronoun, which is the head. Gave is a verb phrase, verb, as there's only one verb, is the verb head. It, as it is the noun phrase after the verb phrase, and the receiver, wait. What did he give? Some thoughts. To whom? To it. This is a noun phrase and is an indirect object performed by a pronoun, which is the head, and some thought is another noun phrase, but direct object made out of the determiner some and the noun thought. Then I will provide the analysis for the rest of the clause. The mouse decided to wait until later for his trek. So decided, round brackets, because these are phrases. Decided to wait is the verb phrase, right? Performing the role of verb. Who decided to wait? The mouse. This is a noun phrase and the doer of the action. The mouse decided to wait for what? For his trek. When? Until later. Therefore, for his trek, there is a preposition, therefore prepositional phrase, and it's an object, right? Inside of that, there's this noun phrase complement. And until later, I think this is an adjective phrase. No, do you know what? I think this is an adverb phrase because it's providing time and it's not modifying any noun. Therefore, it's an adverb phrase acting as an adverbial. Now I'm going to provide the analysis. Inside of this noun phrase subject, we have this determiner pre-modifier. We have the noun head. Decided to is a semi-modal verb. just like have to or need to or want to. And wait is a verb head. Later is an adverb. Head and until must be, I'm not sure, but it must be another adverb. How do I know that? Because adverbs, they modify adverbs. Finally, for is a preposition, is the head. And inside of that thing, there's another phrase, a noun phrase, an obligatory one, therefore complement. And inside of that noun phrase, we have his, which is a determiner premodifier, and finally trek, which is the noun head. Finally, the valency pattern for this sentence is this one. ¿Alguna duda?
Profe, yo.
Dígame.
Entonces la independent clause no se cierra con los cuadrados.
Es que, la,
Hace el mismo análisis.
claro, porque,
no.
exacto, muy bien, porque en el valency pattern, si te das cuenta, esta dependent clause es parte del valency pattern de esta independent clause, ¿cachai? Y solo la marco
Ya.
con square brackets para mostrar que es una cláusula dentro de otra.
Ah, ya, perfecto. Ahora sí.
Ok.
Gracias.
Profe,
Dígame.
si until later es adverbial, entonces supuestamente se puede mover para cualquier lado, ¿cierto?
Colócalo al fondo, mira. The mouse decided to wait for his trek until later.
Y al comienzo también queda bien.
After he gave it some thoughts, comma, until later, comma, the mouse decided to wait for his trek.
Ah, ya, ya, esa era mi duda.
Inclusive la podemos borrar, que es la otra cosa que pueden pasar con los adverbials. The mouse decided to wait for his trek.
Ah, ya.
¿Cachai?
Sí.
La gente que no estuvo con nosotros en el primer semestre, ¿le queda claro? ¿Tiene dudas de algo?
Profe, yo tengo una duda. ¿Qué
Dígame.
significa? Esa es la última letra que puso la A, S, V, A, O.
Ese es el valency pattern. Esta oración está hecha de un adverbial, un subject, un verb, otro adverbial y un object.
Ah, ok, muchas gracias.
Ujú.
Profe,
Dígame.
las dependent clause pueden llevar cualquier valency pattern.
De los que existen, sí. No puedes inventar uno nuevo. No puede ser OVA, ¿cachai? Porque no existe un OVA. Existen SVA, SVO, que son los que aparecen acá, mira, en el otro PPT. Al final, esos son todos los que existen. ¿Cachai? Que el primero es SV, el segundo SVO es un direct object. ¿Cachai? Lo único que podrían variar es que los adverbiales son opcionales, entonces podrían haber 10 adelante del sujeto y 2000 atrás del verbo, pero no va a cambiar el valency pattern. ¿Por qué? Porque los
Ok.
adverbiales son opcionales.
Ok, profe, gracias.
Ok. Dudas. Dudas. ¿Está todo bien entonces?
Sí, profe.
Ya. Me gusta eso. Me gusta ese ímpetu juvenil. Ya, pum, esto lo hacen ustedes. Revisamos en 10 minutos. 14:43, 45. Nos juntamos a las 14:55. Lo hace usted.
Was,
Deprive. ¿Sí? ¿Hasta dónde?
the night
Hasta
before.
before.
Hasta before. La podemos poner adelante, ¿no? Para probar. Because he was deprived of sleep the night before. The cat fell asleep on the warm kitchen. Sí, funciona, esa es. Muy bien.
Profe, entonces, de because hasta before no se podría poner adelante,
Sí, se puede colocar, se coloca adelante, po. Because he
¿sí?
was deprived of sleep the night before, the cat fell asleep on the warm kitchen. Sí, funciona.
Ah, ya, gracias.
Muy bien.
Profe, me perdí.
¿Qué se perdió?
Es que entonces, por lo que acaba de decir, se supone que una dependent clause se puede poner adelante o atrás.
Depende. ¿Sabéis por qué funciona esta? Porque es un
Porque,
adverbial.
ya. Es que
Porque
también me perdí en eso porque en algún momento explicó lo de por qué las cláusulas tienen la capacidad de ser adverbiales o subject o verbal.
sí, esos son los valency patterns, es cómo se genera una cláusula, ¿cachai? Entonces, en este caso, lo que ocurre, y en el caso anterior, en el que está arriba, es que la dependent clause es parte de otra cláusula. Por eso ocurre, por eso se llaman complex sentences, ¿cachai? Porque una cláusula dependent se le pega a una independent. Y cuando se le pega, cumple el rol o un rol dentro del valency pattern de la más grande.
Ya.
¿Cachai? Que el because he was deprived of sleep the night before, eso el why de la cláusula anterior. The cat fell asleep on the warm kitchen. Why? Because he was deprived of this. ¿Cachai?
Sí, sí, sí.
Por eso es adverbial y por eso se puede mover. Se mueve porque es adverbial, no porque sea dependent.
Ya. Y las cláusulas tienen la capacidad de ser lo que sea de todos los Valencia patterns, pueden ser subject,
Sí,
verbal, object, ¿sí?
verbal no, pero subject
Ah,
sí. Mira, te
¿y nos va a
muestro una,
enseñar cómo identificar cuándo son cada cosa o...?
por supuesto que sí, pero por ahora, sí, por supuesto que sí. Mira, cacha esta. Ah, what you told me was right. Esa es una oración y es una cláusula. Y en esa cláusula, la dependent clause es un sujeto. Que está ahí. ¿Cachai? Ahí la dependent es el sujeto. What you told me was right. It was right. Esa se llama dependent clause, pero tiene un nombre más específico. Es una nominal clause. Una nominal relative clause. Pero lo vamos a ver más adelante. Tranqui, tranqui.
Ya, gracias, profe.
Ya. Because it was deprived of sleep the night before. Now, what I have to do is looking for the verb phrase inside of that, right? And the verb phrase is was deprived, right? Who? He was deprived of what? Of a sleep. When? The night before, right? So the other one, the cat fell asleep on the warm kitchen. Fell. That's the verb phrase. Asleep. Wait, who fell? The cat. The cat fell. How? Asleep. Where? On the warm kitchen. Prepositional phrase, noun phrase complement. Okay. Now, because is the subordinating conjunction, he is the noun phrase subject, pronoun head, was deprived is the verb phrase verb, was is the auxiliary verb, premodifier, and deprived is the verb head. Of sleep was deprived of what? Of sleep, right? This thing is a prepositional phrase, and as it answers the question what is an object, Um, of is a preposition, head, then we have the noun phrase complement, and the sleep is the noun head. When, the night before, this stuff is a noun phrase and it's acting as an adverbial of time, right? The night before. Then what I have here is determiner, right? Determiner premodifier, followed by night, which is a noun head. Then before is something, we have to review this, but I believe really fast is something like an adverbial post modifier, but we have to review it in the dictionary. Then the independent clause. The cat is the noun phrase subject made out of the determiner the, premodifier, and cat, noun head. Fell is the verb phrase verb head. Asleep. How did the cat fall asleep? How? This is an adjective phrase. Subject complement. Verb head. Verb head, nada que ver. Adjective head. Perdón. Adjective head. Where on the warm kitchen. This is a prepositional phrase, adverbial of place, with on as a preposition, and the warm kitchen is a noun phrase complement. The determiner premodifier, warm adjective premodifier, kitchen, noun head, and that's it. ¿Dudas?
No, profe.
No, lo pueden hacer todo, está todo claro, no hay problema. Me sorprenden. Muy bien. Okay. Okay. Here we have something different in the following one. When the mouse heard the soft snoring of his sleeping nemesis, he scurried to the pantry and grabbed enough food for a week. The problem with that, well, okay, it's not a problem, but the difficulty with that sentence is the presence of the word and, which is different from a subordinating conjunction. Okay, but we're going to explain that later on, so take it easy. The final one, the dedicated feline sleuth keep his nightly vigil, even though the foresighted mouse will not be venturing out this week. That's not that difficult, I think, and I'm going to ask you to do it later on. Okay, let's move on. We won't say anything about that because we're going to move till dependent clauses. Okay. So we're talking about dependent and independent clauses, and let's go deep into dependent clauses. A subordinate clause or dependent clause is a clause that supports ideas stated in the main clause. That's a very good definition. That's a very good definition. A dependent clause can't stand on its own because it doesn't have enough meaning. But why? Well, because it functions as a supporting idea for a previous clause, right? Subordinate clauses are also dependent on main clauses and would be otherwise incomprehensible without them. So let's take this for example. If I say because you were sick, you won't get it, right? You won't get the context because it's a dependent clause. It needs more context in a more grammatical form. I need to say it needs of an independent clause to be attached to. Okay, the very same with the second, who was in the middle of the road, right? But we still need that independent clause, right, in order to complete the meaning. Whatever you do, the same idea. Summary: dependent or subordinate clauses can stand on their own because they are supporting ideas, right, for independent clauses. There are two kinds of clauses, right? We already discussed this idea. Main clauses and subordinate clauses. A main clause, also called independent clause, can stand by itself and make sense, right? Meanwhile, a subordinate clause, also called a dependent clause, is a group of words. It's not a group of words, it's a clause that contains a subject and a predicate. When I say predicate, I'm saying it contains a verb, a verbal, and objects, complements, and adverbials of any kind, but depends on the main clause to complete its meaning. So for example, we have the main clause, we will not leave the house, and we will have the subordinate clause, unless it stops raining, right? In that respect, the first part, the main clause, the independent clause, we will not leave the house, is purely, I mean, you can understand it quite easily, because it has enough context and enough information on its own. But in comparison to the second, unless it stops raining, you just can't understand, or you can't obtain the entire information because of the lack of it, right? In that respect, the subordinate clause must be linked or joined to the main clause above. How? By making a thing called subordination, which is the title for this slide. The process where a dependent clause is linked to an independent clause is called subordination, right? A subordinate clause, that is to say, a dependent clause, will begin with a subordinate conjunction, we know that, but with some other stuff as well. Relative pronouns, and will contain both a subject and a verb. This combination of words will not form a complete sentence because it lacks of meaning. It will instead make a reader want additional information to finish the thought. These are the subordinate conjunctions, and you must know them by heart. Learn them by heart. Okay? So after, although, as, because, before, even if, be careful. Even if, even though they are two different words, I don't like the term word, but they are two different words, it is just one single lexeme. Gracias, Iron, pero estoy dejando entrar a todo el mundo, no tengo a nadie en espera. Even though the same idea, in order that there are three, but just one single lexeme. Ones provide, and so on and so forth. You can read them. And these are relative pronouns. That, which, whichever, who, whoever, whom, whose, whosever, and whomever. Okay, eso es todo lo que vamos a ver de teoría hoy día. ¿Alguna duda de lo que hemos visto de teoría hoy día? Hablamos de cláusula, valency pattern, las partes del valency pattern, tipos de cláusula, oración, tipo de oración, subordinación, conjunctions, subordinate conjunctions, análisis. ¿Ninguna duda de nada? ¿De nada, de nada, de nada, de nada, de nada? Maravilloso. Chiquillos, vamos a ir a un break. Estamos casi en la hora. Vamos a tomar un break de 15. Son las 15:15. Volvemos a las 15:30. Cuando volvamos, les doy los ejercicios de análisis y los revisamos. Volvemos a las 15:15. Resume recording. Okay, so the idea is we're going to review this in a very slow manner, and if you have any problem, just let me know. So she had a pretty gift for quotation, which is serviceable substitute for wit. Okay, So what we're going to do is this. The very first stuff is making the difference between a dependent and an independent clause. Let's remember this is a complex sentence. The number one is quite different. The difference has to do with the subordinate thing, which, right? Which is the word which is linking the dependent to the independent. So the very beginning is marking this. So this is the verb phrase. Subject. She had what does she have? What did she have? She had a pretty gift for quotation. The problem is, which is a serviceable substitute for wheat. The problem has to do with the fact that the dependent is not outside. That is to say, the dependent is not part of the valency pattern, but part of the noun phrase. So this goes till this point. As you can see, this which, I'm going to change colors. This one is linking the dependent to quotation and not to the verb, right? So it's different from the ones that we saw. Okay, a pretty gift for quotation till the very end. Quotation, that's our noun phrase complement, which is a serviceable substitute for wheat, and this is our relative. And this which is something different. We haven't seen it yet. A serviceable substitute, and here we have a noun phrase, a prepositional phrase, and the noun phrase complement. This is going to be sort of long, so I'm going to provide more space. Okay, this is the verb phrase verb. I'm going to do all the easy stuff at the very beginning. Noun phrase subject. This is the pronoun head. This another thing is a verb head. A pretty gift. She had this. So this is a very big noun phrase acting as an object. A pretty gift for quotation, prepositional phrase. Question, is this optional or is it obligatory? I think it's obligatory. Complement. Now prepositional phrase. And inside of this, we have quotation. And after quotation, we have our relative clause. Okay, this is something new. This is another type of subordinate clause. It's called WH relative clause. Why? Because it begins with a WH word. That's the name. WH relative clause. And I think is optional, therefore post modifier. And inside of that, we have this noun phrase subject with which as a relative pronoun, head. Then we have is, which is our verb phrase verb with a verb head. And then a serviceable substitute for which. This is quite obviously a noun phrase, which is this object. A serviceable, every single word that ends in able tends to be an adjective. Not always, but it tends to. Then substitute. And then for wheat, prepositional phrase, post modifier. And inside of that, we have the preposition head, for, and the noun phrase complement wheat. And that's the result. Any problem? Okay. This is different. Personally, I'm always ready to learn, although I do not always like being taught. Yeah, this is sort of different. It's really difficult. Personally, I'm always ready to learn, although I don't always like being taught. I'm going to try to move the final part. Although I do not always like being taught, personally, I'm ready to learn. Yeah. So the dependent. This is the dependent. This is similar to the ones we reviewed during our lesson, basically because it has although, which is, I'm gonna mark it, because it has although, which is a subordinate conjunction. And not like the very first one because it has a relative pronoun. Therefore, I don't always like being taught. This is the verb phrase. It's a really weird verb phrase. No, I'm wrong. I do not always like. I don't like. So this is the verb phrase. And what we have at the very end, being taught, is another clause. Difficult. How do I know it's another clause? Because it's a non-finite ing clause with a verb phrase, an ing, providing this being taught, be plus main verb in past participle. This is a passive voice. Wow, that was really difficult. And here we have our other stuff. Well, we can say this is a subordinate clause acting as an adverbial with although, which is a subordinate conjunction. This is our noun phrase subject, pronoun head, and this is our verb phrase acting as the verbal part of the clause with do not as an auxiliary verb, always premodifier, and always is our adverb premodifier, and finally like is the verb head. Finally, we have here, this is something very, 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 very rare. This is a non-finite ing. We haven't seen this. Ing clause. I don't like this. Performing the role of object, I think, with being taught. This is the verb phrase made out of two verbs, being, which is the auxiliary verb premodifier, and taught being the verb head. That's it. The rest of it, I'm always ready to learn. I am ready to learn. I'm always ready to learn. I am ready to learn. I'm ready to learn. What is that? Yeah, that's a verb phrase. I am, okay, always ready. I am ready. I am ready. I am always ready. Ready. I ready. Are you ready? No, no. So that stuff, ready is not a verb. Ready is something different. Let's review it. Ready is an adjective. Good. So we have something different. I am, that's the verb phrase. Always ready to learn is an adjective phrase, acting as a subject complement with always as an adverb premodifier of ready, which is our adjective head. And to learn is another clause. Wow. To infinitive clause acting as a complement with a verb phrase, verb made out of a verb head. Finally, we have Our noun phrase subject. This is the verb phrase verb made out of the pronoun head. And personally is an adverb phrase, adverbial, because I can move it. I'm always ready to learn, although I don't always like being taught personally, right? Made out of an adverb head. It was really, really difficult. Let's go with the last one. And the rest we're going to review them next Friday. I finished until the sun went down. I fished until the sun went down. And this is perhaps the easiest. This is the verb phrase verb. This is the subject. Until the sun went down. I fished until the sun went down. This is a subordinate clause acting as an adverbial of until, an adverbial of time, right? Where is my subordinating conjunction? Until. There it is.
Una consulta.
Dígame.
¿Es subordinate clause o es dependent word? Ah,
Any-
no.
Es lo mismo.
Olvídelo.
Thank you. Then this is the verb phrase went down because it's a phrasal verb. Just one single verb. And this is the subject, noun phrase subject, the sun, determiner, premodifier, and noun head. 16:23. Lo dejamos hasta ahí. Quiero reconocer que la 2 está difícil. La 2 estaba difícil.
Profe,
Dígame.
tengo una duda con la 2.
Dígame.
En el to learn que puso,
Ujú.
la parte de to learn, ¿qué fue lo que bajó ahí?
Lo que pasa ahí es lo siguiente. I am always ready to learn, ¿cierto? Sí. Entonces, mi duda era si ready era un verbo, porque si ready fuera un verbo, yo hubiese marcado la verb phrase I'm ready, no, I'm always ready. Dudé, lo busqué en el Cambridge Online Dictionary y ready es un adjetivo. Así que la verb phrase es el único verbo que está ahí. Am, ¿ya? Luego, always ready to learn es una adjective phrase. Les cuento, los adjetivos hacen adjective phrases. Adelante de un adjetivo que puedo encontrar un adverbio que lo modifique, que en este caso es always. Luego viene ready, que es el adjetivo head. Y después de eso, los adjetivos, cuidado con esto, pueden tener prepositional phrases como complemento o true infinitive clauses como complemento. ¿Sí? Entonces, to learn, no, a pesar de que to es una preposición, to learn no puede ser una prepositional phrase. ¿Por qué? Porque learn es un verbo. Y las preposiciones, si tienen un verbo después, ese verbo tiene que ser escrito en ing o nd. Y aquí no tenía ninguna de las dos. La única opción que quedaba era que to learn fuera un true infinitive. Y donde hay una verb phrase, hay una cláusula. ¿Cachai? Por eso se llama true infinitive clause, que es el complemento del adjective head. Como solo está hecha de una frase, que es una verb phrase, o sea, cumple con la regla de las cláusulas es una serie de frases juntas, pero una tiene que ser una verb phrase. Y si fuera solo una frase, tiene que ser una verb phrase. Así que esto es una cláusula. Esa true infinitive clause es el complement del adjetivo y está hecha de una sola verb phrase, que es el verbo to learn. Eso.
Gracias.
Está difícil, lo admito. Está bonito igual. Está difícil. ¿Más dudas? ¿No? Ya. Cierre. Hoy día revisamos cláusula, valency pattern, elementos del valency pattern, tipos de cláusula, oración, tipo de oración, subordinación, análisis. de todo eso. Tuvimos glimpses, pestañeos así, destellos de WH Relative Clauses, ejercicio número 1, non-finite clauses como dependent clauses, ejercicio número 2. Esos son destellos, no lo explicamos en profundidad, pero son destellos, aparecieron, van a aparecer después. Hicieron ejercicios y quedaron con tarea. Clase redonda, está grabada, no tengo nada más que decir. ¿Alguna duda antes de terminar? Estamos, que tengan súper buen fin de semana, necesito que se pongan a estudiar y los ejercicios los revisamos partiendo de la próxima clase. Que estén todos súper, cuídense mucho, les subo el video al tiro.
Chao,
Chao,
profe.
profe.
Chao,
Chao,
profe.
Profe,
Chao,
gracias.
profe. Gracias.
Profe.
Profe, quería hacerle una consulta.
Dígame.
De que la semana pasada había dicho de que iba a mandar, me iba a compartir unos libros que usted tenía.
Deja. Dame un segundo. No se vaya.
Ya.
Espérame un segundo.
No, ok.
A ver si acaso los puedo mandar por. Déjame ver si los puedo mandar. A lo mejor no caben, pero déjame ver si acaso por lo menos puedo mandar algunos.
Ya.
PDF. A ver si acaso puedo. Tranquilidad ciudadana. Tranquilidad ciudadana, documentos, universidades. Tengo acá libros, grammar. Dame un segundo. Dame un segundo. Cierro todas las pestañas. A ver si cabe. Ya, sí. Son 117 megas. Va a pasar por Drive, pero ahí va.
Profe, muchas gracias.
Dale, que estén bien.
Que tengamos fin de.
Tú también. Chao.
Chau.